Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Rose. The new iron mine was a success. Rose thought as he looked over the books that his steward had brought him. That was good, although he still needed to check on the building work on the settlement that would house the workmen once winter arrived. Skilled miners were a valuable commodity in the north. Knuckles rapped on the door to his solar, and he looked up. Enter. The door opened to admit the maester, old Quirrell, who strode in, and then handed over a letter. By Raven from Winterfell, my lord. He took it with a nod and then dismissed the man. As the door closed, he opened the letter, and then smiled slightly. It was from Daenerys. The boy was well, sent his respects, said that he was being well treated by Lord Stark and his household, and wished leave to stay at Winterfell another month. Excellent. He would not have asked for that time, if his visit was not going well. A marriage of Stark and Bolton would cement the ties between the two great houses of the north. He was about to put the letter down, when he saw the hasty postscript that had been added to it. I have late news Benjen Stark has come to Winterfell with Maester Aemon of Castle Black, a most venerable man who had yet more books on the others with him. He stood there for a moment, his mind working furiously. Maester Aemon of Castle Black. Impossible. The man had to be more than 90 years old. Moreover, yes, he was the Targaryen, wasn't he? The last of that name in Westeros, buried in his duties on the wall, forgotten about by almost everyone. This was intriguing, and he walked over to his chair by the fireplace, where he sat quickly and thought things through. Now why would the Maester of Castle Black, a man whose family had cut the head and main branch off House Stark, go to Winterfell? Just to deliver books? He doubted that. And then he paused and leant back, blinking rapidly in thought. No, that was impossible. But there could be no other explanation for it. He knew Ned Stark and respected him greatly for it. He was not the impulsive idiot that his brother had been, and frankly, he was twice the man that his father had been in terms of giving careful thought to matters. No, for his mind Ned Stark was an excellent warrior, because he judged matters on the battlefield until the time was just right, and then attacked. He was not a man who did things on a whim. So why the need for all this information on the others? Some might see it as push so collect and save as much information as possible before winter arrived. But the arrival of one of the oldest and most knowledgeable men in Westeros to Winterfell, straight from the wall, that placed a different slant on things. Why was Aemon there? Why was such an old man, such a blind old man, in Winterfell? To discuss legend? No, something must have driven him there. Then perhaps, a chill went through him for a moment. The legends, the stories of the others, all spoke of terrible things, of dead men that walked, of creatures that could kill with a touch, wielding swords that shattered steel as if it was made from glass. Oh, he knew the legends. They were the stuff of old wives' tales, along with never harm a heart tree, never let a black cat cross your path, and never curse a raven. Why? Who knows? Tales and legends and the stuff spun out of rumor to explain facts that man had no answer for. This was folly. He was worrying over a legend and a trip south by an old man who might have merely been visiting Winterfell to actually escort some old books and papers. He glared at the letter. This was folly. His worrying about something like this. But the word burrowed about in the back of his mind. Would Ned Stark normally bother with such folly? Why had he called to every holdfast in the north for information about a legend about things that were dead and buried? And then he remembered his talk with Daenerys, the day that the call for documents about the others had come in. Why did the wall exist? Why had the Night's Watch stuck to their vows for so long? Did they just defend against the wildlings, or was there something else there? Some old foundation of fact? His eyes flicked for a moment to the tapestry to one side. No, that would just be a waste of time. Surely it would. He stood and returned to the account books, but the figures seemed to dance in front of his eyes, and he kept adding things up wrongly. And as he cursed quietly and scratched through one number and then wrote the right one out next to it, he looked at the tapestry again and then laid his quill down and sighed. Well, if this was a day for legends and folly, then perhaps he should add to it. Rose stood and locked the door to his solar, before walking over to the tapestry. Behind it was a door, old and battered by time. He pulled out a key from a pocket in his jerkin, and paused for a moment, and then inserted it and turned. The lock was old and stiff, and he made a note to add a little oil to it. But the key turned, and the door creaked open. He paused for a moment, and then he reached out to one side, grabbed an unlit torch from the wall, lit it carefully from the small fire in the grate, and then walked through the doorway. The passageway was short, but it changed from smooth stones to rough ones in a few yards, and he had to watch his step. He remembered the first time that his father had brought him along this passageway, and the uneasy feeling that it had given him, as if he was stepping back in time. At the end lay the other door, even older. Another key, another mental note to bring oil, and then he was in the room. It was pitch black in here, lit only by the wavering light of the torch. He looked at the alcoves in the walls and wondered, yet again, what the objects were, and why his ancestors had brought them to this place, and left them there in such reverence. So much had been lost, so much forgotten. There was the hilt and lower half of an old sword, the skull of a bear with green copper wire wrapped around its snout, a human skull, missing the jaw, a knife made of what looked like some kind of dark glass, an old wooden statue of something that had been worn by the passage of so many fingers and so many years that it was impossible to even start to guess what it had once been, a rough crystal in the shape of a hand. And then, the little box. It was made from the wood of a weirwood tree, bound together with wooden pegs. He picked it up and then opened it carefully, taking out the little stones within, each no larger than his thumbnail, before kneeling on the rough flagstones, and concentrating briefly. North was yes, there. The white stone went down to mark north. The black stone marked south, the red one east, and the green one west. The rest he arranged so that they all formed a circle. Then he said the words passed down to his father by his ancestor, and then on to him, the words that he would have to pass on one day to Daenerys. When he said the last word, he looked down at the stones. Nothing. He exhaled slowly. Yes, this had all been a folly. A waste of his. He froze in place, and stared. The white stone had flickered in color for a moment, and then brightened. Not by much, but just enough to show more than whiteness. He reached down with a trembling hand, and brushed the slight layer of dust off it, and the light grew a little brighter. If the stones are lit, then danger. The danger from the others is in that direction, so beware, he said quietly, speaking the words of his father. Be watchful, and then he froze. He suddenly had the strongest feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching him. He knew not how, as he knelt in that small dark room at the heart of the Dreadfort, and for the first time in many a long year, he felt not just scared, but terrified. He closed his eyes, sent out a prayer to the old gods, and then quickly returned the stones to the box, and then put it back in its place. As he did, he stooped. For a second, he could have sworn that he had seen a faint red light in the eye sockets of the human skull. He strode out hurriedly, locking the first door and then the second door behind him, and then, having made sure that the tapestry was in place, he poured himself a goblet of wine and drank it quickly. When he looked down at his free hand, he could see that his fingers were trembling. Ned Stark was right to ask about the others. They had returned. After a long moment he willed his fingers to stop their movement, and then walked to his desk, where he wrote a terse letter to Daenerys. Stay as long as you like. Find out why Lord Stark needs information on the others. If your other matter bears fruit, let me know. You may be called straight back to the Dreadfort, however. Be well. Your Lord Father. Roose looked at it briefly, nodded, sanded it, and then rang the bell for his steward. A moment later, someone knocked at the door, and he stared at it, startled. It was too soon for the man to have obeyed his summons. He strode to the door and unlocked it, to see Quirrell. My lord, the old man panted. A message from House Warwick, my lord. They have most grave news from the Weeping Water. Something crawled up his back for an instant. He had a sudden feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ramsay. He'd kill them all. He'd escape. He'd recover from the 2 arrows in him and what felt like a broken ankle, and then he'd come back and he'd kill them all, very, very slowly, flaying them alive with the smallest possible knife. Perhaps he'd find some way of killing his pampered half-brother so that he would be the heir to House Bolton and therefore untouchable when he returned. But he would return and he would kill them all. He wiped the blood out of his eyes and then frantically crawled through the undergrowth, trying to ignore the agony from his ankle. Thorns scored his hands and burrs filled his hair. There seemed to be blood everywhere, in his eyes, in his mouth, and in his boots. He scowled, and then giggled to himself. Yes, blood. That was important. He could see something up ahead, and he parted the bushes carefully. That was the old path. He knew where he was now. Somewhere on the other side lay the slope up to that outcrop, and that spring. He needed water. Grabbing a tree trunk, he hauled himself to his feet, and then quickly hopped across the path on his good leg, before collapsing into the undergrowth on the other side and listening carefully. No shouts, no calls. Perhaps he had outsmarted them and sent them the other way, and then he started his shuffling crawl again, trying not to cry out every time his ankle hit something. They shouldn't have been here. These were his woods. He snarled the word again and again as he crawled, lost in a rage. Those self-righteous pricks in their own livery and their servants and their arrogant belief that he was committing any kind of crime by hunting in his own woods. He had been about to corner his prey, who had led him a very pretty chase, the little slut. He loved the hunts now. They were the best idea he had ever had. Reek's advice had been valuable. He had a habit of coming up with good advice every time that Ramsay got angry, which was often these days. He had heard that his brother wanted to meet him, and when that day came, he'd kill him and take his place. And then they had arrived, the two young Warwicks and their sister, with their men. They'd taken one look at the naked slut, and then at Ramsay and Reek, and then it had all been up. Reek had gotten an arrow through one eye, so he'd been useless, and it had been up to Ramsay to defend himself. He'd gotten one of the Warwick huntsmen with an arrow in the shoulder, and then he'd run, because then the arrows had come, and the pain and the screaming and the wild flight through the trees, until the fall down the small outcrop that had hurt his ankle, kill his brother. Yes, kill that bastard. He felt dizzy for a moment, and a sickening feeling ripped through him, and he stopped crawling to shake his head. He needed water. He needed that spring. He needed food, rest. A chance to bind his foot and keep going. South, perhaps? Kildameric. The slope steepened suddenly, and he slid down it, leaves and branches going with him, his hands going out to try and slow his slide. His broken ankle hit something, and he yelped with pain and then gritted his teeth and rode it out. When he came to a halt, he looked up. He was in a small dell, and there was the spring. He grinned wildly, and then he stopped moving, and looked around. He was being watched, he could feel it, and then he saw the watcher, and relaxed. A raven, on a rocky outcrop. Just a raven, a stupid bird. He crawled forward slowly, his eyes on the spring, and then he looked back at the raven again. It was just sitting there and staring at him, fixedly. That was not a normal stare for a bird. And then he heard the soft sound of dry leaves being trodden on. He looked over and then pulled his knife out and rolled onto his back, before pushing at the ground with his free hand and good foot until his back was to the outcrop. Who was there? The raven stared down at him. It was starting to annoy him. Branches shifted, and he looked over just in time to see a wolf stride into the dell and then sit down on its haunches. It too just stared at him. Ramsay licked his lips. This was not good. But he had his knife and he was at bay. Nothing could beat him. Nothing. And then Raven cawed 3 times. The wolf got up off its haunches and stood, and then it seemed to double in size, swelling to become a great direwolf, or what he presumed was a direwolf. He blinked hard and then shook his head in denial. When he looked back, it was just an ordinary wolf again. He swallowed convulsively. Something was very wrong here. Had he hit his head? Was the wolf real? And then it snarled at him, and he gripped his knife firmly and prepared to defend himself. But as he did, he felt a weight on his shoulder, and he looked up as the raven alighted onto his shoulder, just in time to see its beak jab down into his eyeball, faster than any raven should be able to move. Pain annihilated the world, and he screamed in agony, flailing at the filthy creature and then falling to the ground, his hands around his eye and his knife in his lap. And then somehow through his screams he heard the growl and the thud of paws, and then he felt the even more hideous pain in his neck. In the last moment before the pain and the flood of blood into his lungs snuffed everything out, he thought he heard an old and very creaky voice say, "A life brought back and a life ended," and then nothing. Aemon! The Maester of Winterfell knew his business. Oh yes, Aemon thought as he sat in the study and listened to the crackling of the fire to his left. There was much to go through, much to collate and describe and pore over, but Luwin had made a good start on the documents that had been assembled so far. It was night apparently, but he had not yet retired to his bed. He had far too much to think on. His great-grandnephew was in the keep. He was still stunned by that knowledge. He had thought the last of his direct kin to be across the narrow sea in Essos, in penurious exile, but instead he had a great-grandnephew that he had not even known about. He thought about the father of the child and repressed a snarl. Young fool! Daenerys had been mad, but Rhaegar to have been obsessed by prophecy, to the point of a different kind of madness, one that had led to the war that historians now called Robert's Rebellion. More than a fool. And now his son was here in Winterfell. Lord Eddard Stark was a remarkable man. Many in the Night's Watch who had heard of him spoke his name with praise. A man of honor, a good warrior and a cunning general. All traits that he admired. But there was something else. The man had deliberately made everyone think that Jon was his bastard son, a lie to protect him. Because he knew that Lord Stark had spoken the truth when he said that had King Robert known of the boy's existence, he would have had him killed at once, as the son of the rapist Rhaegar Targaryen, as dragon spawn. The boy would have to be protected, and he would eventually have to be told of his true heritage, as part Stark and part Targaryen. He nodded to himself. From what he had heard of him so far, and from what he had gleaned from quietly listening to him, Jon was a quiet, sensible young man, who thought before he spoke. No wonder many thought of him as the son of Eddard Stark. He may have had the Stark looks, or so he was told, but he reminded him of his younger brother, Aegon a little. Gone these many years but still remembered so fondly by him. He smiled slightly, and then stilled that smile. Well now, the boy would have to learn a little of his real father, as well as his family, and in such a way that he would not panic at the very thought of being of the same blood as the Mad King. And that would take a little tact. Fortunately, Lord Stark could point to him as being a reassuring presence, to remind him that not all Targaryen blood was tainted with madness. He sighed and ran a suddenly weary hand over his face. This was yet another burden, to add to the many that he already bore, but it was one that he could not shrink from. The boy was family, and Ned Stark was right. He had to be protected. He was part Targaryen and part Stark, especially because the others were coming, as was Winter. And if the Starks were right about that, what else could they be right about? He'd been weighing up what to do for some time now. He had to get the ship into the nearest port in the Fingers, and he was running out of time with every mile that the ship plowed its way northwards. He'd thought up and discarded a dozen plans. Was an emergency needed? Yes. What kind of emergency? Stab the Northman and make it seem an accident. Bludgeon him, perhaps? No, he was too wary and observant. Stab the nurse? No, she was too close to the boy, and he wanted to make sure that the brat didn't scream at the sight of him. Poison the nurse? Same problem. So instead he went for the most obvious solution, make Seaworth think that they had to get to a port at once. The first thing he'd done that night was to creep below and replace the chain for the pump. Even a relatively new ship worked enough in open seas to let in a little water, forcing the crew to man the pump once or twice a day, with one that was old and worn and which would break easily. That was the first part. The second part of the plan was about to be carried out by him right now, sneaking into the bow and carefully arranging for the windlass for the starboard anchor to fail, making the ship lose the anchor itself. With a busted pump and only one anchor left, and with Seaworth being a good sailor, they'd have to find port quickly. He was quite pleased with himself as he crept up to the windlass and inspected it. It was a cloudy night at the middle of the watch, so there was little if any chance of him being seen. He'd opened the small hatch to one side, which he'd slide into the moment that the windlass failed, and the anchor chain went roaring out of the side of the ship. It would be noisy to say the least. Pulling out his knife, he paused as he looked at the bloody thing. Now how to do this? Perhaps, and then he felt a thin, sharp blade being placed on the side of his neck. He froze. I've been sailing these many years, a voice said from behind him in low tones that came straight from Flea Bottom. Fuck, Seaworth. And I have sailed with a great many men. Some were scoundrels and some were good men, and I soon learned to pick out the scoundrels by their eyes. The moment I saw you, I knew that I were looking at a scoundrel. Mycon was about to jerk away from the knife and use his own on the man when he saw the other shadows walking towards him. Drop the knife, or I'll slice your throat clean open. Steel glittered in the light of the moon, which chose that moment to break through the clouds, and he sighed, and then slowly threw the knife away. Now then, Seaworth said as the others arrived and pulled his hands behind his back, let us talk of what you were trying to do, and in whose name you were doing it. And unless you want to swim from here on, I would advise you to tell us all. Derry. He came awake the moment that someone knocked at the door to his small cabin, his hand reaching for the knife under the thin pillow in his bunk. He'd been on edge for the past day. He knew not why. Then he focused his eyes. No danger nearby. "Come in," he croaked. The door creaked open, and Davos peered in. "Ah, good, you're awake. May I come in?" "Of course, Davos." He sat up and blinked at him. Then he caught the look on the face of the other man. "What's wrong?" The older man grabbed a stool and jammed it against the wall behind him, before sitting. "We took on a few men at King's Landing. After we set sail, I realized that one of them was a bad un. Something was wrong with him. And I was right. Tonight we found him creeping towards one of the anchors, after disabling the chain pump. He gave up at once when my lads and I captured him." Dury frowned. "Have you questioned him?" Davos smirked slightly. "Oh yes, man has a very active imagination, which helps when you can hold up a knife and then hint at things." He held up his foreshortened hand and wiggled his fingers, before sobering. His plan was to have the ship seek aid at the Fingers, where he was going to set fire to something, knife you and then escape with the little lordling. Jury stared at the other man in shock. "Who is this blackguard?" "Name's Makon. He does a King's Landing accent quite well, but there's Vel in there and a bit of Riverlands as well. He comes over as a rogue and more than a blackguard, and I think that there's a lot of blood on that knife of his. As for the question of who sent him, there we sail out into murky waters. Dangerous waters." There was a tone in his voice that made Jory deeply uneasy. He asked the question anyway. "Who sent him?" Davos scowled. "Lord Petyr Baelish, the master of coin on the small council, and a man that Lord Stannis trusts about as much as a rusty anchor chain." The last sentence seemed to surprise him a little, as if he had said too much, and he shook his head for a moment. "I'll be taking this Mikon back to King's Landing, or perhaps back to Dragonstone. Lord Stannis needs to know about this. In the meantime, I've posted guards on your quarters as well as that of young Lord Robert, and when we get to White Harbor, we should talk at once to Lord Wyman Manderley. I think that you might need a stronger escort on your road to Winterfell." He thought this through, and then nodded. "Thank you, Davos. I agree with everything you have said. I gave my word to Lord Arryn that I would get his son to Winterfell, and I will welcome any help that can be given." Davos nodded, and then stood. "I will let you know what—" And then he was interrupted as the door banged open and a furious Anna barged in. "Davos, there you are. Your guard is all elbows and knees, like a young colt. He came barging into my quarters, asked a lot of questions about if I'd talked to a man called Mikon, and then he knocked the jar with young Lord Robert's medicine over. We've lost half of it. We'll need more, if we are to get to Winterfell." After a moment she seemed to notice Jory and blushed slightly. "Your pardon, Jory Castle." Jory smiled awkwardly, while Davos sighed. "I am sorry for that, Anna. I know of an apothecary in White Harbor who should be able to replenish your stock of medicine. Do you know what it is?" "No," she said thoughtfully. "Lady Arryn had it made up by someone in the Vale, but surely an apothecary will be able to work out what it is. I am certain that the man I know in White Harbor will be able to ascertain it," Davos said confidently. "Now if you will pardon me, I have go back on deck." And he stamped out, a thoughtful look on his face. Jory looked at Anna for a moment. She was plain, but there was something about her that attracted him, for some reason that he did not understand. She looked back at him, and then she seemed to recall where she was, before curtsying slightly and then leaving. As she left, he sighed and then stood up to get dressed. He had no doubt that he had a lot to plan once they got to White Harbor, and plenty to worry about before they even got there. Finn. He heard the sound of the rowers first, as he awoke, slow and steady. Then he felt the lurch. A boat. He was on a boat. He had to wake up. He needed to open his eyes. But doing so seemed to take an age, as each eyelid was heavy, so very heavy. When he finally opened his eyes, he then almost wished that he had not. He was slumped at the end of a longboat, with a furled sail. In front of him, cloaked and hooded figures were at the rowlocks, 50 or so of them, 2 to each oar, and all rowing slowly but in perfect unison. Theon peered at them, but could see nothing under their hoods, the shadows being too deep. He looked around. There was a shore in the distance, but not one that he recognized. There were trees. Ahead the sun was setting, deepening the shadows, and there was an island ahead. But the more he looked at it, the deeper his foreboding became. There was something wrong with that black shape, but he could not say why. He shook his head slowly, and then frowned. His limbs felt heavier than lead. His head seemed to be stuffed with wool, and then he saw that he was wearing armor. There was a kraken on his chest. He almost smiled for a moment, and then he frowned. There was something wrong with it. The limbs were too thin, the body too twisted. It looked like a mockery of a kraken. And then he noticed the smell, a sickly stench of rot and death. He looked about wildly. Where was it coming from? The sea was too calm. There was no wind. What was giving off that stench? He looked ahead at the island again. It was closer, and it still felt so terribly wrong. Something creaked behind him, and he turned. There was another figure at the tiller, hooded and cloaked like the others. As he watched, the figure gazed at the course. It was keeping the longboat on, and then looked down at him, and it terrified him. It took him 2 tries, but eventually he unstuck his tongue from the roof of his very dry mouth and then looked ahead. The island was closer now, black and desolate, bereft of life. "Steer away from there," he croaked. "Death lies on that island," and the moment that the words left his mouth he knew that it was true. But the rowers kept to their slow, steady work, and the figure on the tiller remained steady on the course. The smell of death was stronger now, and he looked at the other coastline. Weirwood trees. He could see them clearly. Steer for the coast, away from that island. The rowers paused slightly before resuming their work. The fiend turned back to the tiller. "Obey my orders. Steer away from the island." The hooded man looked at him. "Why?" The word was asked in a voice that sounded like rotted leather crumbling. There was something oddly familiar about it. "Death is on that island. Turn the tiller. Make for the trees." The figure turned back to the view ahead. "No." Trembling in every limb, Theon stood on shaking legs. "I am Theon Greyjoy, the son of Balon Greyjoy. You must obey me." The rowers finally paused, but to laugh. It was a noise that sounded like a cross between gurgling and wheezing, and he looked at them in horror at the sound. The stench of death was growing, and he had a sudden nasty feeling that some of it was coming from them. He turned back to the figure behind him and then noticed that one of its hands was visible. It was black with rot, and then as he watched, that hand reached up and pulled its hood off. The face that emerged was a dead, as the hand, black in places, green in others. There was a terrible wound along one temple. Roderick. It was Roderick. "But you're dead." Thepton whispered the words, but the terrible figure in front of him simply smiled through a mouth of cracked and broken teeth. "What is dead may never die, and you cannot give me orders, little brother. Nor me." The new voice came from behind him, and Theon stumbled around to see Meryn sitting on the nearest bench. He too was a living corpse. "I am dreaming," Theon breathed as he looked around. And then the men at the benches resumed their rowing, the long oars going back and forwards as they cut through the still water. "Are you sure?" Roderick hissed at him. He seemed almost amused.
"I am,"
Owen shouted. "You are dead, and this is a dream." The black hand on the tiller swept around and hit him on the side of the face. Broken nails scoring bloody lines. He reeled away, clutching at the wound. "Are you sure, little brother?" He steeled himself, and then turned back. Dream or not, there was danger here. He felt it deep within his heart. Turn away from the island. "Why? There is death there." A shrug. "Death is but a doorway. It holds no terrors for me. I am not dead, though, and I choose the other shore." Roderick stared at him with what appeared to be total contempt. "The other shore? You speak like a Greenlander, all soft and wet. You are supposed to be ironborn, like we are." Khazan bristled. "I am ironborn, and I chose that other shore." Another shrug. "Why?" "I want to live." The Septon looked at the island again. It was still black and desolate, but he could see now that there was something on the nearest shore. Something he could not see clearly yet. And there is death on that island. "You are ironborn, boy," Myron shouted at him as he rowed. "Call yourself a Greyjoy. Father will never take you as an heir." "Turn to the shore," Septon bellowed the words. Whatever was on the shore was closer and clearer now. Something on a mound, and then the boat lurched slightly. He looked at the water and then flinched. Corpses. They were rowing through corpses. Some naked, others dressed, some in their small clothes and some in armor, and all of their eyes were open, and seemed to be looking at him. "No," said Roderick, with deepening contempt. I will not. This is the old way, boy. This is the way of the drowned god. This is nothing but death, the Sauron croaked, and he looked at the water again. Just death. Everything has a price, shouted Meryn, and death is the best price of all. Something creaked, and Finn looked about wildly. Was the longboat safe? And then he saw that Rodrik was staring at him. Oddly, why are you so intent on reaching that shore? His dead brother asked the question in a low, vicious voice. Why? There are weirwood trees there. Because the shore is safe, the Hound shouted desperately. He looked back at the island again. Yes, there was something on the mound, a throne, and a slumped figure on it. Safe? Was safe? Why the weirwood? Are you that much of a Greenlander now? Turn this boat to the shore. I will not, Rodrik roared at him, as his skin rippled and flaked. There was something under it, something foul, and the smell increased, to the point where Theon wanted to turn his head and void his guts, but he dared not. Rodrik glared at him, and then stared at the mast. You, he screamed the word out loud, and Theon looked at him in bafflement. No! What have you done? The mast rippled for a moment, and then Theon gasped as it changed color, turning as white as the trunk of a weirwood tree. What had to be done? Said a voice that was not a voice. Leave the boy alone. Weakling, Rodrik screamed, but who Theon did not know. Come to the heart tree, the Sauron Greyjoy. The voice breathed in his ear, and Theon turned and instinctively darted for the mast. He heard Rodrik scream again in rage, gabbling something about stopping the boy. And as he ran, he saw rotted hands reaching for him. He kicked out and punched any that came near him, sending bits of bones and sinew and dead skin flying, before placing a hand in the mast. The wood rippled again, and then a face appeared in it, the face of the heart tree at Winterfell. The eyes opened, displaying red orbs that seemed to bore into his very soul, and then the mouth smiled at him. Welcome, Theon Greyjoy. We knew your ancestors. Aegon came awake in his bed at Winterfell, screaming, and when he felt the pain on his face and ran a hand on it, he saw blood. Jon Snow. There was something in the air when he broke his fast in the morning. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a faint air of tension over Father, who tore his bread apart, with a slight scowl on his face. Jon watched him carefully, but then eventually shrugged internally and moved on to his own bread and honey, whilst he mulled over whether or not to have extra piece of black pudding. Rodrik Castle would be talking to him about strategy today, and he knew that his brain would need extra food. And then Theon Greyjoy came in, and everyone stared. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed and tired, as if he hadn't had any sleep. And then there were the thin, bloody lines down the right-hand side of his face. Jon really stared at that. Had someone attacked him? Was that what had Father on edge? No, surely Father would have been far angrier if that had happened. And if Theon had attacked someone, then he would have looked more hangdog. Instead, he looked exhausted and faintly bewildered, as if he had been thinking very hard about something. Father leant forwards. Theon? What happened? The Greyjoy started slightly, and then looked up from his perusal of his own piece of black pudding, like a man contemplating a dangerous risk. What? Oh, my face? I don't know, Lord Stark. I woke up from this terrible dream and my face was bloody. The various Starks along the table looked at each other, shrugged, and then went back to eating. Must have been quite some dream, Robb joshed lightly, and then stopped when he saw the look on Theon's face. What did you dream of? My brothers, Theon said, distractedly, as he pushed at the black pudding with a knife and then frowned at it. Only they were dead. I was in a boat filled with dead men rowing. I've never had a dream like that before. It was terrible. There was danger ahead. Great danger, and the sea was full of corpses. Jon looked up at that, and then stopped eating when he saw the look on the faces of Father and Robb, who had both gone very still in that uniquely stark manner that came over them when absorbing news. Bad news at that. Go on, Robb said thickly. What else? I tried to give orders to change direction to the other shore, the safer shore, but Rodrik didn't listen. He slashed my face. He smiled mirthlessly. Some dream. I must have clawed at my own face as I slept. Then he paused. The mast, he said eventually. It turned into a heart's tree, and the eyes opened. There was this voice. It saved me from Rodrik and the others. He shook his head like a dog shaking off water and then speared his piece of black pudding. Your pardon. I'm rambling. Just a dream. Father and Robb had gone completely white. Now and Lady Catelyn had also turned pale. Sansa and Bran were frowning, and even Arya had noticed that something seemed to be wrong. Rickon, on the other hand, was busy making his porridge wobble, now that all the grown-ups were distracted. Thepton took a bite out of his black pudding, and then realized that Father and Robb were staring at him. What? It was just a dream. Father stood up, brushing the crumbs from his beard. The foul one. Come to my solar at once. Robb, you too. Cat, can you join us there? Of course, Ned, Lady Catelyn said distractedly, before noticing what Rickon was doing. Sweetling, eat it. Don't play with it. You'll make a mess. Rather bewildered, Theon stood and joined Father and Robb as they strode out of the room. Jon watched them go with a frown. Something was very wrong. Robb, after the Sand finished telling of his dream, a silence filled Father's solar. He welcomed that silence, as it gave him a chance to reorder his scattered thoughts. By the look on his face, Father was doing the same thing, whilst Mother was looking at Theon as if she had never seen him before. As for Theon, he still looked bewildered. After a moment, Father stood up, and then walked over to Theon, and closely examined the thin, bloody lines on his face. When he straightened up again, his face was set. Theon, I'd like you to see Maester Luwin today. To have him look at that.
Lord Stark, I'm fine. I must have flailed in my sleep and—
I insist. That wound. It is not right.
Tyrion, something jagged did that, and your nails are not torn. Robb looked at Theon's hand and then nodded to himself. Father was right, and Father now sat back and looked intently at Theon. After a while he sighed slightly. But Theon, I'm guessing that you've never had a dream like that before. Have you? The heir to Pike shook his head, looking increasingly troubled. And then Father stood and poured some wine into a cup, before giving it to Theon. Drink this. Vaughan sniffed it appreciatively and then looked up with a frown. It's rather early, Lord Stark, and you've been touched by the old gods, young man. The old gods themselves, and that wound you bear. I think that was a parting gift from the drowned god. There was a long moment of silence, and then Theon drained the cup with a trembling hand before he could spill any, and then he coughed violently, perhaps from having breathed in at the wrong moment. When he stopped, he looked back at Father in deep shock. The old gods. Aye, Father said quietly. Your ancestors worshipped them a long time ago, in the time of the first men, before they crossed the sea to Pike and the Iron Islands. Where the drowned god came from is, well, that's a tale I care not to know much about. There was another pause whilst Tyrion's face ran through a range of emotions, starting with horror and ending with confusion. Yes, but the old gods. I thought that Theon, Robb said gently. I have been touched by them too. And Father, that's a tale for another day. But you are not alone in this. Whatever this is. The Septon Greyjoy looked at him in some shock, and then he frowned. That was what was wrong with you that morning, wasn't it? Aye, Robb said gently. But as I said, that is a tale for another day, because what I have seen is darker than this day. This brought him a doubtful look from Theon, and a roll of the eyes. Darker than a longboat full of dead men? Theon asked, with a slight smirk. Darker than that, Robb said flatly, and the smirk vanished from Theon's face. A tale for later, Mother said with a quaver in her voice. Much later. The Septons seemed to absorb this, and then stood. Then by your leave, Lord Stark, I must go and think on this. He paused. May I go to the Godswood? You may, Father sighed. And if you have any further dreams, please let us know. The Septon, especially of heart trees or the old gods. Much rides on this. More than you might think. Then drew himself up and nodded formally to them all, before walking out, closing the door behind him. Well, Father said eventually, that was something of a shock, was it not? It was, Robb replied thoughtfully. In my memories, Theon never gave any signs of any such dream, nor was he marked like that. This is, well, new. But is that a good thing, or a bad thing? Mother asked thoughtfully. Good, Father said forcefully. We are changing what happened, and in the case of Theon, well, the old gods have touched him. Changed him, perhaps. We must see what happens with him. I do not yet trust him, but if the old gods have touched him, I must think on this. There was a knock on the door of the solar and Father looked over at it, Enter. The door opened to reveal Maester Luwin, who was escorting the ancient Maester Aemon. Ah, Father said quietly. Maesters, thank you for coming. Robb, could you please find Jon and ask him to come here? We have something to discuss with him. Jon Snow. He liked sitting the godswood in front of the Heart's Tree. It was quiet, peaceful, still. He could pray in the morning, and then return to think about life in general. So he'd been rather surprised to discover Theon Greyjoy sitting in front of the Heart's Tree that morning. Very surprised indeed. The squid was just staring at the tree with a look that combined astonishment, confusion, and deep uncertainty. They traded looks for a moment, before Greyjoy nodded slightly at him, and then stood and wandered away. Jon watched him go with a slight frown. Something was wrong with that squid. He didn't know what it was, but he was sure that Father and Robb knew what it was. He considered the matter from as many angles as possible for a moment, and then he shrugged and bent his head in prayer. When he lifted his head again, he saw Robb standing quietly to one side. Father needs to see you at once, he said quietly, in his solar. Jon nodded silently and then walked off. He'd had a feeling that something was wrong for these past few days. Something had been hanging in the air. Something had been unsaid by Father whenever they had met. He knew it. When he got to Father's solar, he was surprised, though. Lady Catelyn was standing at the window and turned to give him a strained smile. And Maester Aemon was sitting by the side of Father's desk, which was laden with books and papers about the old gods and the others. As for Father himself, he was standing by the fireplace, his face somber and his hands behind his back. There was a strained expression on his face, something that made Jon pause, before closing the door behind him. All of a sudden he felt the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He just didn't know why it was there. Was Father going to drop a hint about him joining the Night's Watch? No, that would not have been like Father at all. Besides, it would have been him hinting at it to Father, rather than the other way around. Sit down, please, Jon, Father said quietly. I need to talk to you. Jon nodded and then sat, but then had to wait as Father frowned at the floor, the wall behind him, the door, Lady Catelyn, the floor again, and finally at him. Father, Jon said quietly, have I done something wrong? A small snort escaped Father's lips, whilst Maester Aemon smiled slightly, and Lady Catelyn shook her head with a sigh. No, Jon, Father sighed eventually. This is not about anything that you have done. This is about who you are. Jon looked at Father confused. Who I am? I'm sorry, Father. What do you mean? Father looked at him somberly. Jon, I am sorry. This is something that I have put off for far too long. But I was afraid. I was burdened with a secret, and an oath I swore not long after you were born. The oath your mother made me swear. His mother? Jon's head swam for a moment. Father was talking about his mother. The mother that he had always wondered about, always worried about, always feared that she might be dead. Dread pooled at the bottom of his stomach, nauseating him for a long moment. Father sighed and then stared him in the eye. You have to understand something, Jon. It has always been my intention to keep you safe. That was why I have never spoken of your mother before, because her identity had been a secret if you were to be kept safe. Jon, you are a Stark. No one should ever doubt that. And I am sorry for this blow, as it must be a bitter one, but as I said, I had to keep you safe. I am not your father. Jon stared at Father in shock as the ground seemed to fall to pieces beneath him, and plunge him into an ocean of cold water that he never even suspected was there before. I don't, he paused to try and clear his suddenly dry throat. I don't understand, he finally croaked. Please, Father. I don't understand. How can I be Stark if I am not your son? Father sighed yet again, and then pulled his chair over and clasped Jon's hand. Because you are a Stark. You are my nephew, Jon. I would be very proud to call you my son, but you are in fact my nephew. He looked at Father in confusion, for a long moment, his brain racing. Your nephew, but why would you want to keep me secret and safe? Horror suddenly stole over him, and he stared at Lady Catelyn. I cannot be the son of Uncle Brandon, can I? But Father shook his head. No, he said sadly. You are not the son of Brandon. He took a deep breath. You are the son of my sister, Lyanna. An image flashed through his face, the image of Aunt Lyanna's statue in the catacombs. He'd always been fascinated by that statue, by that face. the face of the woman whose abduction by Prince Rekagor had started the War of Robert's Rebellion, had led to the downfall of the Targaryens. "You mean that my mother has always been in the catacombs?" He croaked the question that was laden with shock, and he saw Lady Catelyn look at him with shock of her own in her eyes, and then sudden tears. Father leant forwards. "Yes, and I am so sorry, John, but her last request to me, her dying request to me, was that I should keep you safe. That meant pretending that you were my son. There was no other way that I could honor your mother's final request." He released his hands, then slumped back in his seat. "She was dying, birth fever, at a place called the Tower of Joy, on the border between the Stormlands and Dorne. She was guarded by 3 members of the King's Guard. There were 5 of us. 5 fought against 3. Only 2 survived, myself and Howland Reed. I found you and your mother in one of the rooms in the tower. The fools hadn't found a midwife for your mother. She might be alive if they had." Silence filled the room for a moment before John finally thought things through. "Wait, my Aunt Lyanna was my mother then who was my father?" Lord Eddard Stark looked around the room and then looked back at John, who had finally made that final connection. "My father is Rhaegar Targaryen." He blurted the words in utter horror. "The son of the Mad King." "Yes," Father said somberly. "He was, and he was not his father. You have to understand that. His reasons were his own, and we'll never know why he did what he did, but he was not mad." "But you're saying that I'm part Targaryen," Jon mumbled in horror, "that my grandfather was the Mad King." "Listen to me, Jon Snow," Maester Aemon said as he leant forward slightly and held out a pointed finger in emphasis. "It is said that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin to decide if they be sane or not. That is a lie. But there is just enough truth attached to the edges of it to make it sound true. Yes, Aerys was mad, driven mad by his burden, by his past, by his own throne. But not all Targaryens are mad." He sat back, and old as I am, I should know. Jon stared at the old man. Yes, he knew that he was the Maester of Castle Black, and that his name was Aemon, but there was something about the way that he had spoken that had gotten the hairs on the back of his neck on edge. "Who are you?" A mirthless smile played about the lips of the old man for a moment. "My father was Maekar, the first of his name. My brother Aegon reigned after him when I had refused the throne, and he was eventually followed by his grandson Aerys, whom they called the Mad King."
Jon swallowed.
"You are Aemon Targaryen," he said wonderingly. "You refused the Iron Throne and took the Black. I did what I thought was right, just as your uncle has done the same to keep you safe. There are many men who would have killed you for your blood. Jon Snow, never forget that, and never forget that although you are half Stark, you are also half Targaryen, and therefore my great-great-grandnephew, and that I have memories of my father and brother being good and just rulers." The old man smiled wearily. "I have listened carefully to you over these days, that I have been here, Jon Snow, and I have heard many good things about you. You remind me of my brother, Aegon, a quiet boy who wanted to help people. Do not fear your blood, Jon Snow, and do not blame Lord Stark for not telling you of your true origins." The smile deepened. "As I said, he saved your life, and if he had not, then I would not be sitting here and greeting one of my own blood." Jon sat there, his thoughts whirling about like a seed pod caught in a stream. Father, uncle, I have much to think about, and," he paused, "I think that I must start by continuing to call you father. Must I not?" "It would be safer," the Lord of Winterfell said with a sigh, and then he set his chin. "My wife has also given me some advice about you. I will write to the king and ask him to make you a Stark. It is what Lyanna would have wanted. It will protect you again, but it will also bind you closer to Winterfell, as if that was ever necessary." And this was something that shocked even more than the fact that he now knew that he was the grandson of the Mad King. To be a Stark in name instead of a Snow, and to owe it to Lady Catelyn, who he knew had never liked him. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then felt such a look of total confusion come over his face that actually sparked a laugh out of Lady Stark. "You pardon, Jon, but you reminded me of the look on my brother's face, the first time my sister hit him with a fish." She sobered. "Jon, as a legalized bastard, you would come after Rickon in the succession, or any other sons that Ned and I might have. You must realize that. I would be happy just to be a Stark, he said in a choked voice. That would be all I would ever need. Not to be a spettered word. Tears blurred his vision, and he wiped them angrily away. Your pardon. Hay fever, perhaps. Mayhaps it is, father said with a cough, and then a hasty smile. Now, there is much I can tell you about your mother, and even some about your father. Jory, the day and a half that it took the Black Betha to get to White Harbor were bloody interminable, to use a word that he had once heard old Lewin once use. The wind was brisk, but there was only so much speed. Davos could get out of the ship. Jory spent the time watching the crew go about their business and worrying about his charge. Fortunately, he had Davos himself to keep him company. The older man was quiet and calm and had a habit of speaking nothing but sense, leavened with a bit of good humor every now and then, as if he could sense just how tense Jory felt. Lord Baelish's man Mikon seemed to be the only villain on the ship, which was not to say that the crew were made up of good men. Oh, some would slit your throat for the right price, Davos had told him the previous morning, but they're loyal to me. See, they know me. Sailed with me. Gods help them. They trust me. And for the most part, they're good lads. They'll get us to White Harbor safe, believe me. And they had. Jory could see the white walls now in the distance, as the ship cracked briskly along, with one of Davos's sons at the tiller, as his father kept an eye on the sails. Little Robert Arryn was next to him, solemnly pointing out things like black-headed gulls and the odd strangely shaped white cap that reminded the boy of something funny. That was the other thing. The boy had, well, not started the trip well. He had clung to Anna, the one person that he really knew on the ship, and had spent a lot of time wailing for his mother and complaining about the smells. He'd also had one of his shaking fits, which Anna had dealt with matter-of-factly. And then Davos had somehow worked his spell on the little boy. He'd been quiet and matter-of-fact, not gruff, just quietly informative. He told the little lordling what the new birds were, how the ship sailed, what some of the smells were. Others had been glossed over, what some of the knots were called, and above all, some of the safer sea shanties, and young Robert Arryn had been coaxed a little out of his shell. He looked to one side. Anna was watching Davos and his stern little guest, with a fond smile on her face, and her arms crossed under that bosom of hers. He looked away. He had more important things than that to worry about. White Harbor awaited. The moment that the ship tied up at the main wharf, Davos sent word to Lord Wyman Manderley about the identity of his passengers, and within the hour an honor guard led by Sir Wendell Manderley, second son of Lord Manderley, was at the wharf, ready to escort them all to the new castle. Davos joined them for the ride up, which was fast and nervous on Jory's part. He did not trust as easily as he had before, and he knew it, which was both a good thing and a bad thing. He needed to be alert and yet not a paranoid fool. Lord Manderley was in the main hall, and was still as huge as ever, and as jolly, but Jory had always had a shrewd suspicion that there was something more to the man than just a fat, jolly, loyal man, and that suspicion was proved that day. Lord Manderley had welcomed the little lordling with just the right amount of deference, mixed with joviality, quickly putting the tired little boy at his ease. Whilst one of Lord Wyman's grandchildren, the one with greenish hair for some reason, played with young Robert in the corner of the hall, Jory, Davos, and Anna all clustered around Lord Manderley. Lord Stark sent word of your coming, and I shall send ravens to Winterfell, and King's Landing to tell of your safe arrival, he told them quietly. But I was most alarmed to hear of the man on your ship, Davos, and you said that you had word on who this man worked for. Davos coughed gently. Lord Peter Baelish, he told the Lord of White Harbor quietly. Lord Manderley absorbed this piece of information with a slightly raised eyebrow. Interesting, he said softly. And most worrying. He seemed to mull things over for a moment, and then he nodded. My son Sarah Wendell will escort you to Winterfell with 24 of my most trusted men. I doubt that Littlefinger has too many men here in the north, but I am not going to take any chances. Not with the only heir of Lord Arryn in my hall. Thank you, my lord, Jory said, feeling a little of the worry leach away. That would be right noble of you. It would indeed, Lord Manderley, Davos rumbled. I must return to King's Landing and report this all to Lord Stannis. Please give him my regards, Lord Manderley replied, still visibly thinking. And tell him that I will do my duty to Lord Arryn by the escort to Winterfell. What will you do with Littlefinger's man? My sons Dale and Allard are watching over him. I trust my crew, but every port has factors and merchants and... Spectres, Saradavos, Turdavos, Spetas, and Netterdowells. I admit that freely. Every port has them, and the fingers are not too far away. I would be surprised if Littlefinger does not have anyone in this city in his pocket, and we shall not take that chance. Your pardon, my lord, Anna piped up. But before we leave White Harbor, we must visit an apothecary. Young Lord Robert's medicine for his falling sickness was knocked over the voyage, and half of it was lost. I know of an apothecary here in White Harbor, my lord, Saradavos stated quietly. I must sail on the next tide after we finish provisioning, so mayhaps we should do that at once. Aye, Lord Manderley said, and then waved a hand at them. Off with you then. Jory Castle, please stay and guard the young eagle. Jory had little intention of letting young Robert Arryn out of his sight any time soon, but still nodded and said all the right words. He had given Lord Arryn his word that he would see his son safely to Winterfell, and he would damn well keep that word. So he watched Saradavos and Anna as they hurried out and then turned his attention back to the hall, where the little lordling was now listening sleepily to a gentle tale of boats on the sea, as told by Lord Manderley himself. He smiled as the boy slowly subsided onto his side and was then gently wrapped up in a blanket by the girl with the green hair, before Willits carefully took him to his room. Jory followed and then nodded at the man as he left, leaving him to guard the door. He minded not the wait. He had stood guard before, and he welcomed the time to think. That the escort to Winterfell would be a good thing, but it would add to the complexities of the trip. Eames would have to be taken over. Shelter found, the north was a hard land, and any man who took traveling over it lightly was a fool. A dead fool, and so he stood, and guarded, and measured the distances and times that lay ahead of them, with his mind. It was just an hour or so later that he heard hurried steps to one side, and he turned his head to see Willits again, with one of Lord Manderley's men. Lord Manderley requests your immediate presence in the hall, the latter panted. It is most urgent. Jory frowned, nodded at Willits, who assumed his place, and then followed the man to the hall, where he found Sir Davos and Anna once again next to Lord Manderley. The Lord of White Harbor waved him over the moment that he noticed him. As he approached the trio, he could feel the tension surrounding them. Sir Davos looked worried. Lord Manderley was scowling, and Anna, well, she was straight of back, white of face, and furious of countenance. Jory Castle, Lord Manderley barked as he approached, his chins wobbling. Your counsel is needed. He frowned. On what matter? On the matter of the medicine of young Robert Arryn, Sir Davos said in a low voice. When we reached the apothecary, he said that he could discern what medicine it was with but a few sniffs. When he did so, he frowned and then he sneezed, and then, well, he blew his nose and accused us of some dissemblance. That the medicine was anything but. Jory felt his eyebrows fly up. It is not medicine. Nay, Sir Davos said, still as quietly as before. It is not. It is a combination of chalk and some metallic powder, the name of which escapes me. The apothecary said that too much of it acts as a poison, and that over time it can provoke fits of fainting or shaking. Jory stared at the group in horror. His first reaction was to think that Baelish's man Mikon had been able to replace the medicine with poison. And then his second reaction was to blink hard, and then stare at Anna. Over time it can provoke fits of fainting or shaking. Where did you get it from? Lady Arryn. Anna said the words in a cold fury. Lady Arryn gave me the medicine. She said that it had been recommended for her son. Recommended? I would like to meet the rogue who recommended that. Meet and geld the man. Jory rubbed his forehead in bewilderment. This makes little if any sense, he said with a groan. Unless someone wants Lord Arryn's son to be dependent on that poison. The others looked at him and he knew that he had the right of it. So we must stop giving him the medicine. No, said Anna with a sigh. Apparently it is best that we diminish the dosage step by step. By the time that we reach Winterfell, he should be free of it. I will return to King's Landing as soon as possible, Sir Davos said between gritted teeth. Lord Arryn must know of this. And I will increase your escort to 50 men, Lord Manderley said tersely. Get that boy safe to Winterfell, Jory Castle. Get him safely there. Ned. His table in his solar was a mess by now. So many books and scraps of parchment, so many notes and scribbled bookmarks, so much rubbish, legends and fantasies, with facts scattered through them, or so he thought. Lewin and Aemon also thought so, however, and Ned frowned thoughtfully as he looked at the great map of the north that hung on one wall. Some of the oldest references in the records referred to places that had subtly different names, and some of them referred to places that he had no idea about. He looked at the table again and then back at the map. One of the oldest records was a fragment of a copy of a transcription of a carving, and it referred to a great siege. The others had besieged a crag somewhere in the western part of the north, and the hints were maddening. There was reference to Ye Stark leading the men, to the ferocity of the fighting, to the fact that the men had to win there, and then the fact that the battle ended in the others being utterly routed in one of the first big victories against them. Where was this place? It was just described as Ye Glittering Crag, but there was nothing in the north that had a name like that, or anything even close to it. The nearest that he could think of was the place called Stark's Rock, but that was nothing more than a slightly craggy hill about a day's ride to the west. It did not look like a place where a battle could even happen, still less a siege, and why would the others besiege a hill anyway? Lewin was still looking into it. He sighed, and then he looked up, as he heard footsteps at the doorway. Kat smiled at him as she came in, but it was not a smile that was truly happy. "Are you all right, Kat?" "Oh, I am fine," she sighed as she sat down and then looked at the mound of papers and books on the desk. "I have just been reflecting on things." He smiled slightly. "Oh," he replied lightly, "we have had much to reflect on. So I can see, Ned, this is a mess." She drew her chair up to the table. "How can you ever find anything when it all looks like this?"
"I get by."
"I remember what the book looks like, or the color of the parchment." A sigh of his own escaped his lips. "Kat, so much has been lost. All we have are fragments. Bits and pieces." He leant over, picked up an old book and carefully opened it to one page. "I mean, according to this, one of the first Starks in Winterfell was known as the Lawgiver, and had something called Ye Feast of Winter. The writer must have known what that was, but I've never heard of it." "Nor have I," Kat muttered as she looked at one of the open books. Then she paled slightly. "Tales of these wights are terrible, and yet you will have to fight them." "I will," Ned replied grimly, "and win. I will have to, Kat. The others cannot be allowed south of the wall, nor can the wildlings. But the issue of how to deal the wildlings has been vexing me. They would make an excellent addition to the garrison of the wall, but they have fought the Night's Watch for so long that they cannot be allies. And besides, what would they ask of me? To settle in the gift, or the new gift? The lords in the north would set up a wail of horror that would strike ravens dead in the sky." Ned shook his head tiredly. "We have so much to do, and so little time. So very little time. If Robb had returned a year ago, then it would still not be enough time. I could have sent more help to the wall. The old bear has already written to say that even just the small number of extra men and construction materials that I have sent to him has been enough to think about reopening Oakenshield. But they need more. We need the resources of the South. We need Lannister gold and wheat from the Reach. We need the Knights of the Vale and the infantry of the Stormlands and Dorne. Men, horses, steel, food, supplies of all sorts. Ships as well." Kat looked at him and then nodded slowly. And then she smiled slightly. "It sounds like you need King Robert and his warhammer." "I know," Ned said, and then smiled suddenly. "I know exactly what he'd say about all this research, though. Something like, 'Ned, just tell me what needs killing.' And then he'd go and kill it." He thought back to the trident and Robert's uncontrollable fury on seeing Rhaegar. "But how do we even kill one of the others?" "The books don't say. As I said, nothing but fragments and legends. How long has it been since they were last seen? How long has it been since one of them was killed?" He shrugged, feeling a bitter sense of despair wash over him. Kata looked at him worriedly and then frowned slightly at the books and papers on the desk. "Nat, is any of this from the mountain clans?" "Some of it. Nothing has arrived yet from the more northerly clans." She nodded, still frowning slightly. "What of other houses that are descended from the first men? Ones in the south. I mean..." Startled, he looked at her. "I never thought about the south. Bronze Yawn might have records in Runstone. That's one of the oldest fortresses of the first men. I'll have Lewin send a raven, at once." But as he turned to the door, he was forestalled by the sudden arrival of Maester Lewin himself. "My lord, I beg pardon for my intrusion. There is a party of horsemen approaching the gates. They bear the banners of the last hearth, the banners of Lord Umber, and he leads them himself." Ned frowned. "The Greyton. Here? The Septon?" Once Robb and John were gone, he went back to the heart tree. It fascinated him. and it also terrified him. The very thought that the old gods were watching him had touched him in some way was, well, Bean shook his head in confusion. He was Ironborn. He was a Greyjoy of Pike. He worshipped the drowned god, even though doing so in Winterfell was difficult. But the old gods, why had they touched him? Welcome, Theon Greyjoy. We knew your ancestors. Those words were now seared across his heart. He'd always known that he had first been amongst his ancestors, but he'd never really thought about which gods they had worshipped. The thought that they had worshipped the old gods was a troubling one. But that dream, he felt the marks on his face, gingerly, and they really terrified him. He didn't think that he had scratched himself in his sleep. Maester Luwin had peered at the lines with a puzzled expression, and then picked something out of one of them. A fragment of fingernail, he said. The Septon looked at his hands. His nails were short, but intact. No, something else had left that mark. Something dark. Something that he couldn't understand. He stared at the heart tree. The face on the mast in his dream had been just like this one, and he reached out with a hesitant hand to trace the face. He didn't know what to expect as his fingers touched the bark, but nothing happened. It was just a tree. There were no gods here, but he felt himself shiver for a moment, feeling cold for an instant. He looked at the face again, and for a moment, just the faintest fleeting moment, he thought that he could see a flash of red from the mouth. The Thayan backed away from the tree, shaking with fear. A gust of wind blew through the godswood for a moment, and as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up on end, he took a step back. The wind almost sounded like a voice, for a moment. A voice saying words that he couldn't quite make out. He was still trembling when he left the godswood. He had the oddest feeling that he had been warned, that something had touched him for some reason that he did not understand, and he felt something else. Troubled. He was Ironborn. He belonged to the drowned god, didn't he? Ned. The party from Last Hearth consisted of 20 men and a wagon, all led by a tall man on a large horse, who was giving orders to his men in a loud, booming voice. Greytan Umber was a man who was larger than life in almost every way. When he laid eyes on Ned, he paused and then bowed, formally. Lord Stark. Lord Umber, Ned replied, feeling a little puzzled. This was oddly formal for the Greytan. But then the big man grinned. That enough of the formal bit. Ned nodded, and then Greytan roared with laughter and enveloped him. A bear hug. Ned, good to see you again. He laughed and slapped the big man on the back as he released him. Good to see you, Greytan. What brings you to Winterfell, though? The Greytan let out an explosive sigh and then jerked a thumb at the wagon. You asked for records on the others. I've brought everything I could from the Last Hearth. The normal jovial smile that was on his face was gone. Ned, I need to talk to you. It's important. Ned looked at the huge man. Yes, this was important. When the Umbers were serious then, something was deadly important. Very well, let's go to my solar. I'll get Luwin to attend to the records you've brought. Aemon as well. Maester Aemon, the Greytan replied, his bushy eyebrows flying upwards. From the wall? Aye, he brought records from Castle Black. The Greytan absorbed this and then frowned, before taking a saddlebag off the rear of his own horse carefully, as if it contained something precious. We definitely need to talk then, Ned. He paused. And do you have any ale? Alen was indeed available for the Greytan, and once he had quaffed his first mug of it, he sat in Ned's solar and peered at the desk in some bemusement, whilst cradling his second one in his hands. The saddlebags were at his side. That's a lot of research, Ned. Sorry that I'm adding to it. Don't be sorry. Now, what's so urgent? The Greytan sighed and then looked down at the floor of the solar. For a long moment. When he looked up, his voice was very quiet, by his standards. Ned, why are you asking about the others? That was a good question. And Ned sank into his own chair. Greytan, there is a long story attached to that question. You think that they have returned, don't you? Startled, Ned looked at his old friend, who stared levelly back at him. I'm not a fool, Ned. Greytan rumbled with a slight smile that quickly vanished. Wildling raids are worse than I've ever known them, and the Night's Watch is weaker than it's ever been. The gift is all but abandoned, and my men fend off raids by parties of wildlings almost every month. The prisoners say that death marches on the wall, and the word from Eastwatch by the Sea is that even the Squawkosi are getting raided, and if even they're getting visits from the wildlings, then they must be either mad or desperate. Something is pushing them south. Something terrible. Ned stared at the Grayson for a long moment. No, he was no fool, but there was something else about the man. There was a look in his eyes that took him aback. Something dark and haunted. Yes, he said eventually. They have returned, and the tale of how I know is a dark one. The great knight held up a hand. You are the Stark in Winterfell, he rumbled. Of all the men in the north, you are the one that would know if they had returned. There was something in his voice that troubled Ned. A note of ironclad certainty. He was used to being trusted, but the great knight seemed to think that the Starks would have known at once about the return of the others. He was about to open his mouth and ask about that when the huge man straightened almost formally in his chair. I need to do this properly, or my ancestors will kick my arse from here to the wall when I die. Right, Lord Stark? I, Lord Umber of the Last Hearth, do hereby inform you that the hearthstone has changed color and that my watch over it has therefore ended. He looked at Ned. Ned looked back at him, baffled. What? Great Sean looked troubled. Did I say it wrong, Ned? Say what wrong? About the hearthstone. Great and I have not the faintest bloody idea what you're talking about. What's the hearthstone? Ned had seen a great many expressions on the face of Grayton Umber before. Amusement, shock, blind rage, puzzlement, but never had he ever seen such a look of utter shock from his old friend. What? The Lord of the Last Hearth asked the word in a very small and horrified voice. You don't know what the hearthstone is. No, Ned said through clenched teeth. I do not. Damn it, Grayton, what is it? I don't understand. You're the Stark in Winterfell. Your father would have told you, on the day you came of age. A horrible feeling came over Ned. Grayton, he pointed out gently. I came of age in the Vale, at the Eyrie. I was ward to Jon Arryn. When I returned to Winterfell, my father was dead. A memory tickled the back of his mind. Brandon must have known. Lyanna wrote to me that our brother had been troubled the day after he came of age, that he had been here, in what was then Father Solar, for most of the day. The Grayton groaned and then threw most of the remaining ale straight down his throat. Fuck me, he said bitterly. I never thought of that. I never bloody thought of that. My father told me on the day I came of age. I thought that your father had done too. Damn Aerys fucking Targaryen. Damn him to the lowest level of the darkest hell that exists. There was a depressed pause before the Lord of the Last Hearth passed a hand over his face and then smoothed his beard. Right then. Bugger it. I never thought I'd have to tell you all this. I thought that you'd have known about it, although what I know is bloody little. Right, Ned. There are 3 oaths that every Umber of the Last Hearth must swear on the day he comes of age. The first is loyalty to the Stark in Winterfell. The second is to protect the crag that the Last Hearth is built on, even at the cost of our own lives. And the third is to guard the hearthstone, to watch over it, no matter what happens. He shuddered and then looked around for the jug of ale that Ned had gotten for him. Bloody thing gives me the creeping horrors every time I look at it, he muttered as he reached over and poured himself another mug. All I know is that just before the last hearth was built, one of your ancestors gave it to one of my ancestors and told him to protect it, to watch over it, to check on the bloody thing once a year, which is a duty that I'm bloody glad to be rid of. It's not ours, Ned, it's yours. What is this hearthstone? Ned asked thoughtfully, his mind whirling with questions about all the things that his close-mouthed father had never been able to tell him about. The Grayson peered owlishly at him and then reached down into the saddlebags, from which he pulled out a small bag, which in turn contained a small box made of stone. It had a lid and it also had runes on the outside, and the Grayson was holding it as gingerly as if it was made of glass, or as if it was a viper from Dorne. Every year I've opened this box and looked inside, the Grayson rumbled. It's always been black as coal. Blacker than... He paused, visibly hunting for words. Blacker than night. It was like there was a hole in the box. And then your raven arrived asking for information about the others, and the news of the latest wildling raid came in and... I thought about the hearthstone. I don't know what it is, Ned. That's been lost. I don't know what it does. I don't even know what it's made from. All I know, all that was passed on from my forefathers, was that if it ever changed color, then we had to bring it to the Stark in Winterfell, as I have now done. Ned nodded slowly. That's all you know? That's all I bloody know, Ned. My forefathers might have known more, but over the years that might have been stripped away, by time and death. He put the box. Please take it, Ned. Every member of my family has always hated the fucking thing. We've always kept it at the lowest level of the last hearth, in the old tunnels. It belongs to the Starks, not to us. I have no idea why your ancestors told mine to look over it. Perhaps because we were loyal. Last loyal hearth before the wall. That's what your ancestors named our hold. And that's the name we took for it. Ned sighed, and then reluctantly took it. The box was cold to the touch, and there's something about it that made the hairs on the back of his arms stand up. He opened the box carefully and then peered into it. Inside he could see a small round stone, the size of the last joint of his thumb. It looked worn and old, very old. There might have been a rune carved onto the top of it, and it was a murky green color, not black at all. What am I supposed to do with this? The Grayson shifted uneasily. When I saw that it had changed color, I touched it. We've supposed to do that every year as well. Last time it gave me a hell of a bloody headache. My father told me that all he ever saw after touching it was black spots. But after it changed color, Ned, I saw the wall, and something else. He swallowed. The dead Ned, marching on the wall, almost pissed me breeches, seeing something like that. Ned looked at him sharply. You had a vision of the wall? Aye, the other man mumbled, taking another gulp of ale. Then he looked at Ned, curiously. You don't seem that surprised by that, Ned. I've had one myself, from the old gods. The great Son stared at him, this time in awe. The old gods? Really, Ned? Aye, and I know what you mean about wanting to piss your breeches. He peered back into the box and then took a deep breath and picked it up. It felt surprisingly warm in his hand, and he weighed it in the palm of his hand. Nothing felt different at all. Anything? The great Son asked, with a hint of nervousness, almost hiding behind his mug of ale. Nothing, Ned replied, and then he blinked. Something felt different somehow. He shook his head slightly. Doom. Ned looked around the room. What was that? What was what? Doom. That noise. Like someone in the crypts is beating on a drum. Ned, I feel and hear nothing like that. Doom. Doom. His palm quivered, and Ned looked down at the hearthstone in astonishment. It seemed to be, well, beating, like a heart, and the color was lighter. You don't see that? See what? Ned? Your eyes, Ned? The Grayson was staring at him, looking at him with awe. They're green, and your pupils are red. Doom, doom, doom. Ned's throat was suddenly drier than the deserts of Dorne. The hearthstone was beating more and more. He could feel the blood thundering in his veins. A mist seemed to be descending over his vision. He opened his mouth again, but then he suddenly froze. The shade of his father seemed to be standing to one side of the great Son, all of a sudden staring at him intently. He was mouthing something, but he couldn't make it out. And then Brandon appeared next to him, and then his grandfather, and then ghostly shade after ghostly shade, crowding the room with what must be Stark after Stark. Doom, 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 doom. And then the wall at the back of the solar seemed to crumble, and he seemed to swoop through it, like a raven on the fleetest of wings. North he flew, his mind stunned, as he looked down at the lands of the north as they passed far beneath him. How was this possible? What was this? A vision. And what a vision! The wall appeared before him, and he winced at the sight. He could see the abandoned castles. He could see the neglect in the gift. He could see the small numbers of Night's Watch. He could almost smell the despair. And then the wall was behind him, and the land beyond it was stretching out in front of him. He could see the wildlings beneath him, see the giants as they rumbled and stamped over the countryside, see the mammoths. He could feel despair there as well, and hate and desperation. Doom, 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 doom. Something seemed to crystallize in the air around him, and suddenly he felt cold, not the cold of the hands or the face, but the cold of the heart that indicated more than despair, absolute hate. Absolute darkness. He seemed to be heading downwards, towards a low mountain ahead of him. He could see lines in the snow ahead of it, what looked like walls that had long ago crumbled into ruin. Age hung over it, age and death. There were things patrolling around it, things that he could not see clearly, and he was somehow glad of that. Closer and closer to the mountain, and then suddenly he was flying straight at the ground. He wanted to fling his arms up to stop, but instead he slid through the snow and ice, the earth and stone. Down he went, bewildered, and then out into a great hall, where he finally slowed. That hall was dark, lit only by shards of light coming from somewhere far above him. It was covered in ice and snow, a barren hall with only a dais towards one end, where a figure sat in a throne made from ice and bone. There were things in the dark areas of the hall, things that might once have been human but which were now not, and as he looked at them they seemed to feel his gaze, and mewl, and wail, and throw twisted arms out in an effort to hide their faces, as if they were ashamed at what they had become. Ned drifted closer to the throne. Behind it there was a great dead tree, a mockery of a heart tree, with black bark and bare rotted branches, with a face carved into it that seemed to glow with a terrible blue light. And the figure on the throne, well, it was human-shaped, had been human once. Now its skin was blue and white and was dressed in old armor that seemed to almost shine dully. Its eyes were closed, and a crown of horns seemed to be on its bald head, and then Ned realized with a jolt of horror that the horns were growing out of its skin. He gazed at it, horrified. The face almost had stark features, the cheekbones especially. And then the figure opened its eyes. Azure orbs, they were, bluer than the sky at midsummer, and colder than the heart of a glacier. The eyes went to him at once, and he stared back, too afraid to move even if he had been able to. Bone and sinew creaked, and then the figure on the throne stood and gazed at him, and then it smiled for a long moment, and said something in a tongue that man had long forgotten. All he could sense was hate and cold and evil. The figure stopped talking, and then smiled again, and then its hand shot out and its fingers clenched. The air around Ned seemed to creak, but he sensed that the odd crystallizing sensation he had felt earlier was protecting him, because the creaking stopped after a moment. The figure on the throne, the king of the others, if a king he was, frowned at his hand, and then clenched it again. Once again the air creaked and groaned, but once again it seemed to meet resistance. The others stared at him with bafflement, and then rage. It threw back its head and screamed, revealing white and fanged teeth, screamed a scream of rage and fury. The ice in the hall shook with the sound, shards cracking and falling, and some of the things in the shadows wailed and put their hands over their ears. The mockery of the heart tree bent like it was caught in a storm, branches snapping off, the ground shook and the throne trembled, and still Ned was unscathed. And then the king of the others ceased his scream and just looked at him, his finger coming up to point at him. The azure eyes narrowed and he peered at him as if he was committing his face to memory. And then the figure started to chant something, in a tongue that was even more alien, dark and twisted, and filled with power. Ned could feel it building, and then suddenly he was falling backwards, pulled by a wind that seemed to surround him, tumbling like a leaf caught in the wind. On and on he flew, seeing snatches of things out of the corner of his eyes. The wall, castle black, the last hearth, Winterfell. He was home. He wanted to be home. He blinked, and as his eyes opened again, he was back in his solar, with the Greyton still in front of him. Ned felt as weary as he ever had before, and he was panting as if he had run a mile unshod. Every part of him seemed to hurt, even his hair for some reason. Ned the Great Son was shouting at him. "Are you all right? Speak to me, Ned." With a shaking hand, he placed the hearthstone back in the box. "They are coming for us," he muttered, through a mouth as dry as ashes. "The king of the others is awake. They are coming." And then he fell backwards in his chair and fainted dead away. Robb, there was so much to learn, Robb thought almost despairingly as he looked at the list of noble houses of the north. Yes, he already knew the names, but it was the complex web of details that was driving him raving mad. The links between major houses and minor houses, not to mention the histories of those houses. He knew about the revolts of the Boltons in far more detail now, but he had not known about the tensions that existed in some of the lands around them. The knowledge had depressed him more than a bit. He knew now that he should never have trusted Rose Bolton, that the Rose Bolton's main allegiance was to Rose Bolton first and then, perhaps to father, based on what they had been through in the War of Robert's Rebellion. He, Robb, had not the same amount of loyalty owed to him. He thought about all the dead men that he had led south of Mokatton, in that future that must never happen, the dead that had died for nothing. He had been a king in the north, but he had not even been able to hold his own lands. Well, that would change. He had the north to protect now, and he would do so to the last drop of blood in his veins. He closed the book and massaged the bridge of his nose. He had a slight headache from his studies, and he sighed and stood up from the bench in the courtyard where he had been studying. A cawing noise from one of the walls to one side caught his eye, and he looked up in time to spot a flash of black, just a crow. And then he saw the tower and he scowled. There it was. There was the tower, where Bran had fallen. What had he seen there? He could guess. Oh, how knightly of that bastard Lannister. How brave. A man against a boy. He remembered the false sympathy on that bastard's face, and the honeyed words of the queen, with their underlying drip of poison. And then after that, the scars on the palms of his mother. No, it would not happen again. He would swear any oath on that. He turned from the tower and strode across the courtyard, detailing all the things that he and father would have to do. He wanted to look into the supplies for the wall that afternoon. That and work out a way of sending more men. 100 men sent now would be worth twice that number in a year, and the more after that the better. He knew how hard it would be though. Winter was coming. Men needed to fed, watered, paid, housed, mounted. The sound of laughter broke him out of his grim reverie. Laughter and then song. Oddly enough his heart lightened. Roose Bolton could not be trusted, but Daenerys Bolton was another matter. He was either the greatest dissembler ever, or he was a genuinely kind and courtly young man. Skilled with a harp, skilled with a song, and always ready with a smile. He had already given young Bran a number of lessons on riding, and he could tell that his younger brother already admired the heir to the Dreadfort. As did Sansa, who he could see with Daenerys as he sang to her. Septa Mordan was sitting to one side, attending to her embroidery with a slight smile, and when she saw Robb she nodded respectfully to him and then quietly stole away. Sansa and Daenerys both saw him at the same time, the first with a smile and a frown, and the second with a courteous nod, as he continued his song. Robb smiled at them both, and then politely listened. Yes, the man was skilled in music. He could certainly hold a note far better than he ever could. When Daenerys finished, he bowed to Sansa as she applauded, and then turned to Robb. Your pardon, Robb, but is your lord father around? He had turned slightly pink as he stole a look at Sansa, who was blushing suddenly and trying to look demure. I would like to speak to him. Oh ho. He had an inkling that this might happen, and he schooled his features to look grave and thoughtful. I believe that he is in his solar, he replied. Allow me to take you there.
My thanks.
Daenerys turned to Sansa and bowed again. My lady! Thank you, Daenerys, she answered, and then plucked a rose from the nearest bush, disguising the sudden wince from a thorn quite well. Will you wear this for me? I shall, he replied with a smile, taking it from her and threading it through a buttonhole. Lead on, please, Robb. They strode away across the courtyard, Robb leading with a slight smile. Oh, Sansa was taken with this one, and from what he had heard and seen, Daenerys Bolton was not his father, was far better than his father, and above all he was many, many leagues better than that little shit Joffrey. As they walked they talked about this and that, the hunting in the area, the signs that winter was not yet here and how much Daenerys had enjoyed his stay at Winterfell. I hear that a party from the last hearth arrived this morning, Daenerys told him, and Robb frowned. He had missed that. I did not know that, he replied, as they passed through a doorway, and then up the stairs that spiraled their way up. Did you see them? I certainly heard them, Daenerys quipped. The man leading them was most loud. I believe that it was. Ned, the voice boomed down the corridor. Are you all right? Speak to me, Ned. It was coming from the solar, and it was the voice of Great John Bloody Umber, and Robb's heart leapt. The man had been his fiercest bannerman and loudest voice, and he seemed to be worried about father. He tore down the corridor, Daenerys at his heels, and burst into the solar. Father was in his chair, shaking as if in the grip of a terrible palsy, panting as if he had run a race. He was holding something in his hand, which he now placed into a box, and the Greyton was staring at him as if he was terrified, and then he saw father's eyes. Green fire seemed to be in them, with red at the center, and when he heard Daenerys gasp in astonishment, he knew that the heir to the Dreadfort had seen what he had seen as well. They are coming for us, father said in a voice like iron being beaten. The king of the others is awake, they are coming. And then his eyes closed, and he collapsed in his chair. After a moment of horror, Robb leapt for him. Father, he cried, and he saw the Greyton look at him. Greyjon, what happened? The Greyton stared at him, deeply confused. Who are you again? Robb Stark, what happened? God's boy, you look like a Tully. Oh, yes, I gave your lord father the Hearthstone. It was given to my ancestors, from yours thousands of years ago, to be watched over, to be protected. It changed color this year, so I brought it south to your father, and he held it, and he saw something. I know not what. But you heard him. The great John looked grimmer than he had ever seen him look. The others have returned. Oh gods, Daenerys choked, as he crouched by father and stared at him. The others? Robb shook his head. What is this Hearthstone? Something that we have kept watch over for many years, the great Son rumbled. We were closest to the wall. I think that was why we were given it. I know not why else. He peered at father. Perhaps we should give him some ale. And then father came awake suddenly. His eyes were normal again, but there was a look on his face of deep intent. He looked about wildly for a moment, and then he looked at Robb. Robb, father, search my solar. Search Winterfell. Look for anything my father might have left. Anything at all. Look for old rooms, old records. Search. And then he collapsed again. Robb stared at his father and then ran to the door and peered out. He could see Luwin hurrying down the corridor. Come, Luwin, quick. And then he looked back at Daenerys and the Greyton. We must search. Tyrion. Father was sitting in the smaller of the breakfast rooms that morning. Casterly Rock was a huge fortification, with a huge number of rooms, but there was nothing like having breakfast with the sun on your face. Well, it was mid-morning at least. Ish. Tyrion swung himself up onto the chair at the table and cast a careful eye over father. He was sitting at the head of the table and was glowering at a piece of paper in front of him. It was not a nice glare. It was a glare that dared the small document not to burst into flames. He looked further down the table, where Uncle Kevin was busy tearing a small roll apart with his fingers and doing his best not to look worriedly at his brother. He then caught Tyrion's eye and shook his head ever so slightly. No, asking father what was wrong was not a good idea. Instead, Tyrion bowed to everyone from his seat, chose some bread and honey, and then ate quietly as he ran through what he'd ate the previous night, and if there had been any exotic cheese involved. He was pretty sure that there had not been, but that wine had dulled his recollections of the meal just a bit. As he dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and then thought about perhaps a honey cake or two, father finally stood up with a growl, grabbed the piece of paper and stalked over to the window. Are you well, Tywin? Uncle Kevin asked quietly. No, grunted father, before stalking back to the table and dropping the piece of paper in front of his brother. I do not like things that I cannot explain, and the more I think about this, the less it makes sense. His uncle picked up the crumpled piece of paper, smoothed it out, read it, and then frowned at father, before shoving it down the table at Tyrion. Odd, he said cautiously. Tyrion reached out and picked it up, and read it. Then he read it again, and then a third time. Only then did he speak. Eddard Stark is asking the Lord of the North for information. Legends, stories, and other information about the others. It would seem so, grumped father as he stalked back to the window and glared out of it. What do you make of it? Tyrion's first thought was that perhaps Eddard Stark had contracted a sudden case of curiosity about the legends of the North, but then he had second, third, and fourth thoughts about saying that father would not be behaving like this for an answer that simple, nor would he react well to such an answer. Instead, he leant back in his chair and thought deeply and swiftly. Yes, father was right. This was odd. A Lord Paramount of Westeros, especially a lord like Eddard Stark, who was said to be deeply serious, would not send out ravens to his main lords on a whim about a legend. This meant something. After more thought, he had to confess that if it did mean something, then he knew not what, which irritated him. This makes no sense, he said eventually. This provoked a snarl from his father. I know that. Stark merely wants information on the legendary others, Uncle Kevin muttered. It's odd, but am I missing something? Uncle, from what I've heard of Ned Stark, I do not think that he would send a raven lightly. But this seems so trivial that I do not understand it. I made the mistake of underestimating the North once, father muttered as he clasped his hands behind his back and glared harder at a hill in the distance. After Ned Stark led the first northern host to travel south of the Neck for hundreds of years and won at the Battle of the Bells, and then at the Trident, I swore that would never underestimate that man ever again. He holds his honor too high, and the man would not last a month at King's Landing, but he is not to be underestimated. And this message means something. I just do not know what. He turned on his heel and glared at them both. I have seen the Games of Thrones played by many men. I have seen it played by madmen and lost, like Daenerys Targaryen. I have seen it won by savagery and brilliance, aided by luck, like Robert Baratheon. I have seen it bungled repeatedly by oafs, like Mace Tyrell. And I have seen it apparently thrown away by dreamy fools, like Rhaegar Targaryen. But this move by Eddard Stark, it does not fit into any stratagem that I can think of. It makes no sense. He bit the last 4 words out as if they pained him, and then he turned and glowered again through the window. Tyrion ran a number of possible answers to that through his head, decided that none of them were much good when father was in this kind of mood, and instead devoted himself to further thought, broken by a yawn. Yes, he really did have to ask what the cheese had been last night. Then he paused. Could this be a coded message to his banners? But what, and why? There is no reason for the North to plot at the moment. Surely. Robert is a friend to the Starks. They grew up together. Father's glance at him might possibly have held a smidgen of slight approval. Then you see the problem. It could be something to do with the wildlings, Uncle Kevin mused. I have heard that their raids get worse every year. Yes, but the others? Tyrion shook his head. Might as well ask about Grumpkins and Snarks. Why the others? I do not know, father said crossly. And to make matters even more confusing, word has reached me that the Maester of Castle Black is at Winterfell on this matter. Do you know his name, Tyrion? He thought quickly, and then paused. Wait, isn't the Maester of Castle Black Aemon Targaryen, the one who turned down the Iron Throne? He still lives? Uncle Kevin spluttered, having been surprised in the middle of drinking some weak ale. Oh, he still lives. Father ground out. Aerys was always looking over one shoulder at the wall when he was at his most paranoid. Tyrion absorbed this, and then pursed his lips slightly in thought. We need answers then, father. Perhaps I should take a trip to Winterfell. Father swiveled an eye at him. With what possible pretext? Why, I've always wished to visit the North, and to see the Wall, and should I happen to ask in Winterfell about the others who know what I might discover? There was a pause. Uncle Kevin looked at Tyrion worriedly, whilst father looked out of the window musingly. It might be dangerous, father said eventually, but perhaps a dwarf like you might be able to find out a few things, instead of degrading this house with your drinking and whoring here. Don't think that I didn't see you yawning. Yes. I think so. Travel north, Tyrion. Go to Winterfell. Ask some questions. Don't come back until you have answers. And then father swept out. As father's footsteps receded down the corridor, Uncle Kevin turned to him. Are you sure about this, Tyrion? It seems a risk. 'Tis the least I can do. Why, uncle, I shall be asking questions about legends whilst I read. And the thought of sending me into a place like Winterfell almost brought a smile to father's face. Now, how often does that happen? Uncle Kevin winced. Tyrion, this is a chance for me to see the North, the Wall. Why, I can take a piss off it and be the tallest Lannister ever. And this finally brought a smile to the face of Uncle Kevin. Then I will help you plan this carefully, Tyrion, and I hope to see you back here soon. Although must you give your father so many arrows to send at you by whoring so much? He stared at his uncle. I don't know why father said that. I didn't visit any of the usual places at all last night. No, the yawns have another cause. What was last night's cheese again? Daenerys. He vowed that he would remember the voice that Lord Stark had spoken with until the day that he died, whenever that might be. Surely the old gods had been speaking, though the Lord of Winterfell. He had heard it and trembled, like a leaf at the words. The others had returned, and the king of the others was awake. And now, a day later, he and Robb and the others were still searching the main keep of Winterfell, looking for anything that might have information about the deadly enemy north of the Wall. After giving the orders to search, Lord Stark had collapsed again, and had been ministered to at once, first by his frantic eldest son and then by good Maester Luwin, and then finally by a frantic Lady Stark. Exhaustion had been the Maester's conclusion, and Daenerys and Robb had helped Lord Umber to carry Lord Stark to his bedchambers to sleep. Lord Umber had looked at him mostly strangely when he heard his name from Daenerys, and he had inwardly cursed his father's reputation, as well as that of the family name. He would swear it again and again. The time would come when people would hear the name Bolton, and not quiver with fear and dread. And now he, Robb, Jon Snow, and the Greyjoy boy, who seemed to be always thinking about something these days, were all assembling in Lord Stark's solar, where Lord Umber was pacing about like a bear with a thorn in his foot. When they were all assembled, Lord Umber raised an eyebrow at them. Well, I found an old storeroom at the bottom of the broken tower, with 6 barrels containing 1,000 old nails, Jon said quietly. But nothing else. There is now in the first keep that we could find, sighed Robb, as he gestured at Theon. Save dust and dead spiders. And I searched the crypts, Daenerys said somberly. I found nothing. Jon Snow jerked his head slightly at the mention of the cryptas, and then he scowled slightly. We need to think about what we're looking for, he said musingly. Lord Umber, who had been rubbing his hand over his beard and scowling, looked up at this. What do you mean? Lord Stark, told us to search for anything that his Lord Father might have left behind for his sons about the others. Anything that would have been left behind by his ancestors. Yes, Jon replied, but from what I have heard of him, Grandfather would not have left any records or objects that were precious anywhere where they could have been damaged. The broken tower leaks when it rains. So does the first keep, and the crypts are below ground. Yes, the last 2 are old, but surely past lords of Winterfell, not to mention the old kings in the north, would have found a safer, drier place for them. There was a silence, whilst his words were weighed by the others. By the gods you speak sense, boy, Lord Umber rumbled. Then we must search in the great keep itself. Is there any word of father? Robb asked worriedly. He has slept for a day so far. Lord Umber smiled through his beard. Your Lord Father awoke an hour ago, apparently hungrier than a direwolf puppy, and about as strong. He will join us soon. I'll join you now, said a voice at the doorway, and they all turned to see Lord Stark walk in. He looked tired and drawn, but there was a slight smile on his face. Greatjon, thank you for taking charge of Winterfell whilst I slept. He sank into his chair with a sigh and then looked at the little stone box on the table with an enigmatic look. How goes your search? Badly, Lord Umber said. Ned, your Lord Father must have had something passed down to him. Some mention or hint or word. You said that Brandon was troubled for a day after he came of age. What could he have been told? I know not, Lord Stark sighed, before frowning and then looking about. Wait, could it be that simple? What could? Robb asked. This was my father's solar before it was mine, Lord Stark said somberly. I replaced the rug and added that bookcase in the corner, but I have not touched the rest. Have you searched here? The others all looked at each other, and then rather sheepish smiles emerged. It would seem not, Daenerys said with a smile. Lord Stark, with your permission. Granted, Daenerys. Granted, Lord Stark replied as he stood with a groan. You'll have to search without my help, though, as I feel as if every part of me is still tired. And so they started to search. Walls were tapped on, bookcases moved, rugs rolled up and stacked in a corner, until finally they faced the tapestries that were hung on 2 of the walls. One, showing a godswood with children of the forest, peering out shyly from behind the trunks and branches, revealed nothing more than a wall. The second was different. It showed Bran the Builder at the wall, and behind it there was a door, a locked door. Lord Stark stared at it, deeply shocked. Why is it that I never knew that was ever there? Why would you have, Ned? Why would you have looked for it? Lord Umber said somberly. Your father never had the chance to even tell you about it. This was all supposed to have been Brandon's. A silence fell, a somber one. Then Lord Stark stepped up to the door. Well, I am here now. He looked at the lock. One thing that father did leave was a set of keys, most of which looked as old as Winterfell. Robb, can you open the second drawer down on the left of the cupboard by the door? They should be there. He frowned slightly. I hope that one of them opens it. If father took the key to this door south with him, then, well, the wildfire would have melted it. A deeper, even more somber silence, until Robb returned with the keys. And some of them did indeed look as old as Winterfell itself, but a few looked as if they had been used more recently than the others, and Lord Stark fingered them thoughtfully and then tried them at the door. The first would not turn, nor would the second. But the third did, with a squeal of a protesting lock, and as the door opened, Robb Stark muttered about the need for a little oil in the lock. There was a dark void behind the door, a passageway that Daenerys knew that only the Stark in Winterfell should enter. But Lord Stark turned to them all. We will need torches. No, lanterns, he said huskily. We will need light. Lanterns were brought, and then Lord Stark stepped through the doorway, followed by Robb and Jon, then Lord Umber, and then Theon, and finally Daenerys. There was much dust underfoot, but the air smelled dry and not damp, and after a few paces Lord Stark stopped to examine the wall. The stones are different here, he said musingly. As if this part of the keep was built around another older building, a tower perhaps. Daenerys thought about this. Lord Stark, he called out. There are parts of the Dreadfort that are similarly built. Old parts built over and around. I wouldn't want to guess what might be hidden there. Given your family, lad, I really wouldn't want to know what might be in those walls of yours, Lord Umber rumbled, and Daenerys was glad of the near dark, for he felt his cheeks grow hot with shame. Great John, go easy on the lad. Lord Stark chided, and then they passed on down the passageway until they stood in front of another door. This one was wood again. Weirwood perhaps, with a dire wolf carved into it. Not the usual dire wolf of the Stark banner, but something older and rougher. A total silence fell, and then they all watched as Lord Stark reached out and traced the outline of the dire wolf with a finger that shook slightly, and then he pushed the door, which gave with a creak of hinges. The light from the lanterns caught the dust as it billowed slowly up. There was a great stone slab in the little room, and alcoves in the walls around it, and they were all filled with odd things. There was a dull mirror of beaten bronze, a small leather bag that looked dried and rotted, and by the edges that were peeping out, contained what looked like arrowheads made from some kind of glittering rock. There was a skeletal hand in a small iron cage, with a dusty plaque under it, and he watched as Lord Stark brushed the dust away to reveal what looked like runes of some kind. A tiny figure of a fat man with his legs crossed, made from some kind of green stone. And then there were the cylinders the length of his arm, with caps in the end about the width of a man's fist, that were stacked in many places, as well as what remained of a great and very old book. It looked as if part had been burned at one point, and it lay on the stone slab before a chest of very old and weathered wood. By the gods, this is old, Daenerys thought with reverence. No, these are old. He looked around, seeing more things in various alcoves, and as the hairs on the back of his neck rose up, a feeling came over him that all of a sudden they were no longer alone, that the ghosts of past Starks had suddenly gathered to witness this discovery. Lord Stark leaned over the bench and looked at the half-burnt book. Even some records are better than no records at all, he muttered. Robb had reached for one of the cylinders, and opened it, and suddenly he looked up. Father, this is full of paper. No, parchment. This one has hide, I think, John added, having opened one of his own. And that is no skull of anything that I have ever seen before, Taryn Greyjoy said with a slight quaver as he pointed at a something that had horns growing from it. There is dust everywhere. When was that door last opened? When my father was alive, Lord Stark said with a sad smile. He held up a piece of paper that was also covered in dust. This is a note from him, to remind him to tell Brandon about. He squinted at the paper. The keys to this place, and to dust a little more often. Ned, look at this, Lord Umber said with excitement in his voice. Daenerys looked over with the others at the alcove that Lord Umber was peering into. There was a little bowl there with a rune carved in the middle of it, and a small depression at the bottom. That's the same rune as on the hearthstone, as if it belongs in there. Lord Stark nodded. Jon, will you go back to my solar and get that little stone box, please? And do not, for the love of the old gods, touch what's inside it. Jon Snow nodded and walked quickly out of the room. As he did, Lord Stark turned to the chest and peered at the clasp. Unlocked, he said musingly, and then opened it. The hinges on it also let out a squeal that made them all wince, before the Lord of Winterfell let out a grunt of surprise. As they all watched, he reached in, and with a slight grunt of effort, picked up a huge mace. If such a word could describe the thing that he held, it was made of a dull metal of some sort that had not a touch of corrosion or rust. Old leather wrappings were wound around its handle, and its head, well, it was a thing designed to crush and kill, and it had stones of some sort, almost like the arrowheads in the bag, embedded in its head. This was not a weapon of chivalry, this was a weapon of death. Robert would love this, Lord Stark said with a slight smile. This is a mace with but one purpose. Footsteps rang on stone, and then Jon Snow was back with the little box, which he handed over to his father. Lord Stark took it with a word of thanks and then opened it, before taking a deep breath and pulling out a small worn stone. He weighed it in his hand for a long moment and then relaxed a little, before placing it into the little bowl. A perfect fit, he said. I wonder what it does. And then the bowl flared with light, as if the sun had briefly been within it, and Daenerys heard a great voice in his head that drove him to his knees. The others come. The Stark calls for aid. You are needed.